So one of the things that's extraordinary about Western Australia is it's an ancient landscape. It contains the oldest minerals known to man, and it also is home to the oldest evidence of life, the stromatolites. 3 billion years plus old, which is why you now see that the southwest of Western Australia is extraordinarily diverse. You have the Kimberley, probably the most intact tropical savanna left on the planet. And then as you go to the southwest, it captures elements from cool, wet plant species all the way through to desert species across the interzone that is the southwest of Western Australia. Jurien Bay is found on the Lejeune sand plains, and it's known as a hotspot within the hotspot because of its extraordinary diversity of plants. So the myriad of colours in these wildflower explosions really reflect the sort of ecological processes that underpin them. So some species are pollinated by birds, other species are pollinated by invertebrates. So that colour really reflects the diversity of life. So one of the projects that WWF are currently working on is with the Jurien Bay community, working with local enthusiasts searching for 3 species of priority plant that currently are known from less than 5 records in that area. Ultimately, what we want to do is find out what their population is, where they are. With some of these species, we simply don't even know whether they're still in existence. We don't know where they are. Across the world, there are 34 regions that are considered biodiversity hotspots. And so they tend to be mega diverse in species richness. So in the southwest, we have 5,000 plus species of plant. The other thing that needs to be a biodiversity hotspot is it needs to be under threat. In the Kimberley, and in fact across the state, we also have a massive problem with feral predators. So WWF have really utilised sensor cameras for the last 5 or 10 years across the Western Australian environment. The reason for that is they're a really good way of picking up what animals are in the environment. WWF has started to work on a Kimberley bilby project. We have realised that potentially the last remaining population of bilbies in Australia that will actually be thriving occurs in the southern Kimberley, and yet nothing's known about this population. So we're working with the traditional owners, the rangers and other environment groups to really understand where these populations are, whether they're under threat, and ultimately to actually ensure that appropriate land management practices are put in place to look after those populations of bilby. The numbers and the density of animals that actually once occurred here are far less because of the predation going on by those feral species.
I first visited Nangeen Hill in the late 1960s, and at that time there were probably 50 or so rock wallabies living on that rocky outcrop. Later I visited it, we found the numbers were much lower, and it seemed that the foxes were getting more common, but also feral cats were starting to predate the wallabies. And the numbers there had dropped from probably around 100 down to only 5. WWF partnered with the Department of Parks and Wildlife to build a feral animal proof fence 5 kilometres long around that rock and its surrounding habitat. And since the fence was completed and the feral animals were removed from inside the fence, the numbers have gone up from 5 to 34 at the last count.
For many of those species, they're actually severely threatened because of landscape change and predation. You can't clear 70% of a landscape that is biodiverse as it is and expect species not to be at risk.
If you're from Western Australia, you've seen salinity. It's when there's salt on the surface of the land, so all the plants that were there have died. If we look down to the lowest part of the landscape, well, the first thing you notice is the dead trees. But it's very much dominated by a particular spiny rush that is a weed and very salt tolerant. The salt got there because we have too much water, and we have too much water because we took the trees down.
My father's generation and the one before basically cleared the land, and we decided to do something about it. We kept the stock out, fenced it off, and just let things grow back.
So Ray decided with other farmers to leave a legacy for the future, and he worked very closely with WWF, the Natural Resource Management group around here, and also the state and federal governments to put a covenant onto this land. That means that this land will be protected in perpetuity, even if it is sold onto another farmer.
Crackemire used to be a dairy farm, so a lot of that native vegetation was cleared out years ago. So a lot of the food trees that those black cockatoos utilise, and also trees where they would roost. Now we're in the process of re-establishing the plants that should be in this environment. We had some land available that we wanted to do some replanting in. WWF was good enough to provide us with the plants and some volunteers and also staff to establish those plants. So Jarrah is one of those species. We're looking at around about 200 to 300 years for it to develop sufficient hollows for the red-tailed black cockatoos.
We're living in an ancient environment where things take time. The protection that's going on now may take decades or hundreds of years before we actually see the result of it. But we're confident that through these measures of working with the local stakeholders, with the traditional owners, with scientists, with local community groups, to make sure that there is a collective ownership of the natural environment. By working together, we can address the key threatening processes that are indeed threatening these species. For the last 35 years, WWF have an extraordinarily proud record of working in Western Australia. From protecting Herdsman Lake and the other wetlands around Perth, to working with local communities in the wheat belt, where our work with hundreds of landowners has protected 10,000 plus hectares of bush. Through our work on marine protected areas, places like Ningaloo Reef and the Kimberley Marine Parks, WWF are trying to get very large sanctuaries to protect the dolphin and the fish and the coral species that occur in those environments. Western Australia is like nowhere else. It's a landscape that captures the tropics all the way through to the temperate ecosystems. It is a landscape of diversity. There's a sense of belonging for the Western Australian community and ownership.
I feel like we've done the right thing, and hopefully descendants will think the same in years to come. How lovely the bushland is, how good it is for their psyche and their children. And we're not the only species on Earth. We need to protect all the others. It's sort of our role, I think, from now on.